Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?
Please take your seats and fasten your seatbelts.
Flight crew, please prepare for takeoff.
Flight 229, you're clear for departure.
Thank you and enjoy your flight.
Hello, everyone. My name is Graham Mann, and this is the Business Aviation Podcast. On this podcast, we interview business aviation professionals with all sorts of backgrounds to learn about experiences, tips, and best practices to be successful. This episode's guest is Gene Bishop, who is currently captain and department safety manager at a private flight department, flying Gulfstream G-IVs and an AStar helicopter in Birmingham, Alabama. Gene was born and raised in Los Angeles, is a former U.S. Army aviator, both helicopter and fixed wing, and an Operation Iraqi Freedom veteran. He flew EMS helicopters for 10 years and also manages several large Facebook groups dedicated to promoting aviation safety and helping aviation professionals chart their career paths. In this episode, we talk about Gene's own career path through the U.S. Army in various roles, including as an EMS pilot, some of the stories he has about aviation safety, his advice for aviation professionals in figuring out their career path, and much more. Make sure to check out the show notes for details and links from the conversation at leansystems.co/podcast. Please enjoy this episode with Gene Bishop. Gene, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start back at what I think is the beginning. And you were a line service technician. Was that your first job in aviation?
My first job was detailing airplanes. I did that starting at 17 years old. Did that for about 8 months and then got hired at the FBO that we worked out of as a line service tech. So officially the detailing job was my first foray into aviation.
And how did you get into that job originally? Was it just sort of what was available?
A friend of mine from school had started doing it, and he called me, and we both shared a love of aviation and both wanted to be pilots. So he called me one day and he said, "Hey, this detailing company is looking for people. If you want to come sign up, be a good way to learn about airplanes and get to work around them." So he brought me in, and it was all downhill from there.
So you mentioned that you'd always kind of wanted to be a pilot and had an interest in aviation. How long had that been? Had that been something since childhood, or what got you so interested in it?
It was a goal from as far back as I can remember. My mom and dad tell stories about when I was 4 years old playing soccer. I'd see an airplane flying overhead, and didn't matter what was going on the field, everything came to a screeching halt, and I'd stop and watch the airplane until it was gone. It's just something that's always been there.
Can't imagine your soccer coach appreciated that too much.
Oh, no. I'm sure I earned a place on the bench for that.
Okay, so you were a line service tech for a couple years, and then after that, you joined the Army. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, so, first of all, thanks for your service.
Thank you.
But I guess that was in line with your goal to become a pilot. Is that why you joined, or were there other reasons as well?
It was. There were several reasons. My father, his father, my uncles had all served, so it was kind of I wouldn't say an expectation, but more of a family tradition, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
They were my father and my grandfather were both drafted. I was obviously went in voluntarily, but it was just serving in the military in one form or another. Not necessarily the Army, but my first choice was Marine Corps. But they weren't taking pilots at the time. And then I heard about the Army Warrant Officer Flight Training Program, where you didn't have to have a college degree, and you were guaranteed a slot in flight school, given that you passed the physical and the tests. I decided to explore that option because I was working full time, actually working 2 full-time jobs while trying to go to school, and it wasn't working out very well. My grades were suffering as a result of my work schedule. So it quickly became apparent that I wasn't going to meet the 27-year-old cutoff at the time for the Marine Corps and the Navy or the Air Force. So I went and talked to an Army recruiter and asked about the Warrant Officer Flight Training Program. Took a bunch of tests, and about a year after I started the process, I found out I was accepted. I was one of 6 out of 650 qualified applicants to be accepted.
Wow.
So it was a very intense, very competitive program at the time, and why they picked me, I'm still not sure, but very grateful they did.
So, yeah, a few things in there. You, why did you prefer the Marine Corps over the Army? Just out of curiosity. And you don't have to answer.
Friends in
I'm just
high school.
curious. Yeah.
I'm trying to formulate the answer. Had a few friends in high school who were very gung-ho about the Marine Corps, and they knew a whole lot more about it than I did at the time. But in talking to them, I grew to admire the camaraderie, the pride and ownership, the tradition and the history of the Marine Corps. And there's something about a Marine that is different than any of the other 4 branches.
Yeah.
I don't know how to put it into words, but there's a certain pride that they have, and I wanted to be a part of that.
Right. Oh, that makes sense. And you mentioned you were going to school as well during that time.
Correct.
What were you studying?
Just aviation science at the time. It was a junior college.
Okay.
I did all my ground school and for my private pilot's license there, and that was part of the aviation science degree program.
Right. Now that was not Embry Riddle.
No, it was Glendale Community College in Southern California.
Okay. So you entered the warrant pilot training course?
Correct. I got accepted.
And how old were you at the time?
23. It was August 1990.
Okay. Cool. So what was that training like? And then what was your eventual role that came from that, at least during your first stint? I think you've had a few positions.
Yeah. I first left on August 23rd, 94. I left for basic training in Fort Jackson, South Carolina. That was about 9 weeks. And that was just same basic training as every other soldier goes through. Learning about the Army, learning how to be a soldier, essentially. Qualification on the M16. Just basic combat training, same as everybody else. And from there, I went to Fort Rucker, Alabama for the Warrant Officer Candidate School, which was normally a 6-week course. My class actually went through, we were kind of an experiment. We went through a 4-week program that was designed specifically for reservists and National Guard soldiers. And they took a bunch of us active duty guys and kind of put us in to fill in the class. So I was in the first class to go through the Warrant Officer Candidate School in 4 weeks, and that was incredibly intense. And people ask me what the difference between the Warrant Officer School and basic training was. And in basic training, the drill instructors take you by the hand and lead you around from station to station and tell you what you got to do today. And everything's laid out for you, and you just have to kind of show up.
Right.
Whereas Warrant Officer School, since it's a leadership development course, they're building officers. It's more the TAC officers laid out, okay, these are your goals for the week, go. And it was up to us as a class to figure out how to accomplish all of those goals. And, it was really an exercise in delegation and prioritization, because they'd give us 3 hours of work and 20 minutes to do it in.
Right.
So it was far more psychological, far more challenging psychologically in Warrant Officer Candidate school. The TAC officers were very hands off. They told us what needed to be done, and like I said, it was up to us at that point to figure out how to do it, when to do it, and who was going to do it. And in addition to getting up every morning at 4 a.m. and running 5 or 6 miles and doing all the physical stuff on top of that, it was very challenging from a mental standpoint.
Yeah, sounds like it, but probably realistic training for later in your career, I suppose.
Yeah, very much so. It was training us to be leaders, whereas basic training was training us to be followers, essentially.
Right.
A junior soldier doesn't have a whole lot of leadership opportunity, whereas a warrant officer, you won't be a leader right off the bat, but in a year or two after you pin your bars, you're being given responsibilities and more of a leadership role. So it's important to have that background and really have the confidence to know that you can take a group of people and accomplish a goal.
Sure.
Without having to be told exactly what to do and how to do it.
Right. So what followed Warrant Officer Candidate School, the 4-week course?
After that, we went into, at the time it was called Initial Entry Rotary Wing, which was basically Army flight school. It was 4 different courses that took place over the course of about the next year. There was primary training, which was 6 weeks, and that's basically just learning to fly the helicopter. We started out in the UH-1. I went through all of my flight school training in the UH-1, and there were two students to one instructor, and they took us out. They taught us to hover. They taught us takeoff, landings, auto rotations, basic navigation, just the very basics. It would be the equivalent of getting your private pilot's license, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
From that point, we transitioned into instrument training, which was 3 weeks in a simulator and then 3 weeks in the aircraft. And that was all about flying in weather and learning instrument flight rules and also learning how to operate as a crew, pilot and co-pilot.
Mm-hmm.
It was that was probably the most intense training we did, because we were out. My first day in the aircraft, I'd never flown in a cloud before in my life, and my first day out in the aircraft was a bad weather day, and we went out and we flew around in rainstorms and clouds and did all kinds of things that I'd never done before. So that was kind of a
thrown right into it.
Yeah, exactly. And looking back, it was a great way to learn. So much today is done with view limiting devices. They call them foggles, and it's all simulated. Whereas there's no substitute for going out and actually flying around in a cloud.
Sure.
It kind of forced us to hone our skills in a hurry. After instruments, we moved on to combat skills, and that was all about learning low-level and formation flying, nap of the earth flying, land navigation, learning to read different types of maps, landing in off airport landing zones, confined areas, all different kinds of things. Tactical flight profiles. I think that was a 4-week course, and that was a lot of fun. We were down flying along below the tree lines, along rivers, and doing all the kind of gung ho Army flying.
Right.
At that. From there, we went into night vision goggle training, which was another 4-week course, and basically that was learning everything we'd learned in combat skills, but doing it at night using night vision goggles. And the biggest challenge to overcome there was the fact that the goggles are they're one-dimensional, so you're having to learn how to identify the visual cues that we normally take for granted. There are ways to how do I put it? There's basically different tips and tricks for figuring out how far away you are from something versus what we normally see with our normal 3-dimensional view.
Almost learning how to see differently.
Yeah, exactly. You're learning the cues and the illusions, and how you can get yourself in trouble and how you can get yourself out of trouble, basically.
Right.
And that was really interesting. Things I never would have thought about otherwise. And I think I said it was a 1-dimensional view. Obviously, it's 2-dimensional.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was that was the final flying portion of flight school. Then we went into what's called Warrant Officer Basic course, which is just kind of I guess it's a finishing school of sorts. We're now, according to the Army, we're now trained pilots. We were warrant officers, and now they took us out and they put us through the survival school and a little bit of professional development, just kind of finish off the process. And after that, we were pinned with our wings and sent off into the world to do good things.
Okay, so this is like roughly a year after you started, or 18 months?
Yeah, it was about 14-month process for me, because in between each course there were bubbles, anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, where we were just sitting around waiting for the next class to start.
Right.
So yeah, it everything from start to finish. If you did it from day one to the last day, it was 6 weeks, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, and 4 weeks. So what's that? 20 weeks plus another 4 weeks for the Warrant Officer Basic course. So a little less than 6 months, start to finish, of total training time.
Right.
But then you add the bubbles in there and spread it out. I'm not sure what it is today, but it's probably somewhere around the same amount of time.
Sure. So once you graduated, what position did you end up being assigned to?
I was originally going to go fly Blackhawks in Korea, but that got changed at the last minute. I was assigned to flying Hueys at National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California.
It's a big shift.
Yeah. It didn't really hurt. I was from Southern California, so it was like being sent to my backyard.
Right.
It was flying up in the high desert, and it was actually, it's one of 2 assignments I've had in the Army, so I really have nothing to compare it to, but I've heard that it was one of the best assignments, best kept secrets the Army had to offer. I was up there for 6 years, and in that time got to do a little bit of everything. We were attached to what's called a Core Support Battalion, and we were a utility aviation company, so we were anything and everything that came down the pike. we got it and we did it. We flew search and rescue, firefighting, general transportation, security, photography. What else did we do? My primary mission was as an opposing forces pilot. And what that means is National Training Center is one of the biggest desert warfare training centers in the world. And every month they have what's called a rotation. They get a unit coming in from the regular Army and coming out to train on various desert warfare tactics and techniques. But they put on mock battles, and we were the bad guys. So my aircraft were painted up in funky tiger stripe camouflage. We had 3 different laser systems to simulate various weapon systems. And basically, we'd go out and play laser tag with tanks for a week at a time every month. And yeah, obviously, the reason for doing that is we're training our soldiers to prepare for whatever threats they're going to come up against in a combat situation.
Right.
And our primary purpose was to teach them what they did wrong and how to avoid making those mistakes again in the future. So after each battle, we would go out and debrief the training unit. And as the week progressed, our confirmation that we were doing a good job was they would be harder to find and they'd be shooting us down more often. And probably the best compliment I ever received in that position was a young soldier who came back from combat in Iraq and told us that the threat we presented to him was 100 times harder than the threat that the Iraqi army presented.
Right.
And that that was kind of a neat story.
Yeah.
He made it a point to come up and thank us and shake our hands, and he said, "Man, you guys are a whole lot tougher than the real guys."
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, I'm sure it was stressful, but that does sound like a lot of fun playing laser tag with.
Yeah, a lot of fun, and our mission was to save lives by providing the training, and it was definitely you go home at night feeling good about what you'd done during the day.
Right. And I mean, you must have had to study foreign tactics.
Oh yeah,
to actually present well.
We went through what they called the OPFOR Academy, and for us, it was we had to learn Soviet bloc attack helicopter tactics. There were several former Russian Army helicopter pilots out there teaching the way they were taught to fly, and a lot of the times those were the profiles we flew, but we also specialized in what's the term they use for it? Unconventional warfare.
Right.
We'd simulate a small rogue nation or something, and we'd go out and do stuff that wasn't in any of the playbooks, and with the intention of being unpredictable and coming up with things that these soldiers hadn't been trained for.
Right. I'm sure it's fairly interesting to contrast what you were learning with what you'd been taught tactically.
Very much so. It was night and day difference. The Eastern Bloc tactics were very much in your face and overwhelm you with numbers, and you shoot one down and there's 10 more coming behind them. Whereas the U.S. Army is more, at least from the attack helicopter standpoint, it's more about cover and concealment and hiding behind terrain features and that sort of thing. Whereas we were out in the open chasing tanks through the desert.
Right.
So it was definitely a big change in the way I just finished learning to fly.
Yeah.
I had to go back and relearn a whole new way to fly. But
Right.
it was very fascinating, and the process involved in it was not something I'd ever think of being associated with the U.S. Army. I mean, how often do you go take lessons from Russian and Soviet Army attack helicopter pilots?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And you also did some scheduling while you were there, right?
I'm sorry, say that again?
You also did some scheduling, is that right?
Oh, yeah, I worked
Some flight
as a
scheduling?
flight operator.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did flight ops officer, and that was in addition to my flying duties. I was one of 3 flight ops officers at the unit at the time, and we were responsible for scheduling 26 aircraft, and we had 64 pilots when I first got there. And by the time I left, we'd changed from 26 Hueys. We had 16 Hueys and 12 Blackhawks. So it was over 80 pilots when I left.
Right.
It was kind of a logistical puzzle a lot of times.
I was going to say that can be very challenging.
But yeah, especially considering that different missions require different qualifications, and not all pilots were qualified to do everything. For instance, we had some pilots who were qualified as night vision goggle pilot in command, whereas others were just daytime pilot in command. So trying to figure out who was qualified to do which mission and then scheduling them accordingly. It could be a challenge on busy days. But always seemed to work out one way or the other. We never dropped a mission.
Right. And did you guys were you planning constantly, or you had like a planning window for a certain upcoming time?
A little bit of both. There were some missions that were planned, months and weeks in advance, and others that popped up at the last minute. Example, we also supported the Space Shuttle recovery program at Edwards Air Force Base, and the Army took the lead on that, which was kind of surprising. I was one of the air bosses for that mission, and we were responsible for scheduling and coordinating. Let's see, it was 7 Army aircraft, 1 Air Force helicopter, 1 Navy helicopter.
Right.
And those missions, when we go train with NASA and the Air Force, those missions were scheduled a couple months in advance, and we knew about them. So there's preparation lead time that had to go in there. So those we were able to plan in advance, and we had pilots who were specifically trained for that mission. So that kind of made the planning real easy. Had a small batch of pilots, and they were going to be on that mission regardless of what else was going on. Then there were the OPFOR flights that were usually scheduled 3 or 4 weeks in advance. Be they the battles, the air assaults, or whatever needed doing, even just the VIP transportation for the battlefield. Mm-hmm. Those were pretty straightforward, and they were pretty much the same month to month. So we could plan ahead for those. But it wasn't uncommon to get pop-up flights with, less than 48 hours notice. General so-and-so wanted to go from here to there, and we had to go down to LA and pick somebody up and bring them back to Fort Irwin. Various, that kind of thing happened fairly regularly. But as many aircraft and pilots as we had, there was always somebody around to do it.
Right. And it was a fairly manual process, was it? Like you guys didn't have software or tools to help with
No,
that?
no, we had a whiteboard that was probably 20 feet by 10 feet. And each pilot had little magnets with their name on it, and their names were color coded to reflect their qualifications and their currency, and
Right.
it was kind of a unique and I mean, for somebody to come in off the street and look at it, it wouldn't make any sense.
Right.
But
Your original spreadsheet.
Yeah, exactly. And watching somebody try to manipulate that, and well, this guy can't do this mission because he's not current, and this one's current, but he's on another flight, and it was it was a kind of a ballet at times, but like I said, it always seemed to work out in the end.
Right. And so during your time, during that stint, at least, I think maybe you went into the reserves after, but you also did go to Embry Riddle? Is that?
I did. I took a bunch of courses at the satellite campus. They had it at Fort Irwin, and took 2 classes over at Edwards.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of my attempt at continuing education. I was pursuing a bachelor's in aeronautical science at the time. Never did finish it.
Right.
Still on my list of things to do.
Well, you did have a 4.0 while you were there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
So
that I was pretty proud.
I mean, were there habits or tactics that let you be that? I mean, it's a lot to balance, both working full time and doing courses.
It was I think the difference between Embry Riddle and Glendale Community College. I wasn't working nearly as much. I had one job, and flying with the Army allowed me a fair amount of time to do homework and do research and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that played into it was that they were all condensed courses. I think they were all 6 weeks or less. So I was going 3 or 4 hours each week, and having everything so compacted and condensed into that short period of time actually made things a lot easier for me.
Okay.
The information was fresh, and it never very far. It was very intense, but they were small classes. I think there were 5 or 6 of us in each class. The instructors were amazing. They were all established professionals, and the formula just seemed to work for me.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah,
easier to retain information, I guess, in that shorter time period.
Yeah, and that's about the time when the internet was coming into its own. So the access to information was far easier, and it was engaging material as well. It wasn't something I was bored with and just doing because I had to. It was aviation safety, aviation law, very interesting subjects. And again, they were all taught by the people who were actually out working in that field at the time. So it was easy to stay involved and interested and engaged in it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So after being an Op 4 pilot and flight operations officer in Fort Irwin, what came next?
The end of my active duty service obligation was coming up, and I'd applied each year that I was eligible. I had applied to switch to fixed wing aviation, which on active duty is done via a review board and a selection process. And there were always thousands of applicants for a couple of dozen slots. So I never got picked up on active duty for the fixed wing assignment. However, going into the reserves, it's basically like a job interview. You have to find a unit that has an opening available. Then you go out and you talk to the commander, and you apply for that position specifically. And the selection process is a little bit easier. It's a little more subjective. More about finding the right personality mix, and bringing people out to interview was great. It allowed me to see what the unit was about, allowed them to see me, and it and there again, for some reason they picked me up and agreed to send me through the fixed wing course for the Army Reserve, and that was the unit at Fort Rucker that did that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
what was your motivation for switching to fixed wing?
Fixed wing had always been my first love. I went into the Army with my private pilot's license in fixed wing in about 400 hours fixed wing time.
Mm-hmm.
And while I enjoyed my time in helicopters, fixed wing was just a primary goal. Not exactly sure why. There are elements of both fixed wing and rotary wing that I enjoy, and if I had to choose one over the other right now, I'm not sure which way I'd go.
Right.
But it had just been an unfulfilled goal to advance my fixed wing training and fly more advanced high performance aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And especially with the Army, fixed wing slots are so few and far between, or at least they were. Having that feather in my cap and coming out being dual rated and having that training in my bag of tricks was definitely something I wanted, from a career standpoint.
Sure. So you made the transition to the Army Reserve?
I did. I switched to the Army Reserve in February 2002, and had to wait about a year before there was a slot in the fixed wing course open. So I started the fixed wing course. I guess it was more than a year. I started the fixed wing course in June of 2003, and that was a 12-week course. After that, I went back to my unit at Fort Rucker, and was qualified as a co-pilot in C-12, which is just a Beach King Air.
Mm-hmm.
And we flew the operational support airlift mission, which is a fancy way of saying VIPs. We were the military's airline, essentially. We would fly. Our unit was assigned to Operational Support Airlift Command, which is actually an Air Force unit, but they're just a clearinghouse. If somebody wants to go from point A to point B, they call GOSAC, and GOSAC assigns whatever the most appropriate unit is for that mission. And so our missions would come down from there, and we just shuttle people all around the country, around Central America, went down to South America a couple of times, Caribbean. And like I said, it was just normal point A to point B, VIP instrument flying.
Right. Now, during some of that time, you also worked around the New York City area. Is that right?
I did. My first civilian job out of the Army was flying for a company called Heliflight Shares in New York City. It was a fractional ownership helicopter program. At the time, it was only one of only two in existence. Flew the Bell 430. We were based at a Newark airport, but flew all over the Northeast. There's two-pilot IFR operation, flying some beautiful helicopters. still miss flying.
Well, my next question was two parts, but how did the civilian job compare to your time in the Army? And also, was there a specific reason you moved to New York, which is a long way from LA, where you grew up, and California?
That's an excellent question. How did it compare to flying in the Army? It really didn't. Where flying at Fort Irwin was flying out in the desert in the dust and dirt and old beat up Hueys with very basic instrumentation. Flying in New York City was about as close to the polar opposite of that as you can get. It was high flying, spit and polished aircraft with state of the art avionics, autopilots, the whole 9 yards. And what appealed to me about it was they did a lot of instrument flying at the time, which was relatively rare for a helicopter pilot to do a lot of IFR flying. But that's what I enjoyed. Civilians aren't going to pay me to go out and chase tanks with helicopters, so that was the next best option. Flying in the New York City area, I figured would be as big a challenge as I could get in the VIP flying mission. I figured if I could master that in New York City, then I would be safe to fly pretty much anywhere.
Yeah.
And that's proven to be true. I mean, it's the airspace up there is like none other I've ever seen. Helicopters or fixed wing, it's something that has to be experienced to be believed.
I lived there for a few months last year.
Okay.
And occasionally it happen. The first time it happened, I couldn't believe it, but it ran out along the west side of Manhattan there at around 4 p.m. and was shocked to find that there was actually a queue of helicopters waiting to come in and land and pick up people and take off again. But it was like helicopter traffic exists in New York City.
Oh yeah. It's intense. They're everywhere. Like swarm of flies.
Yeah, I could not believe it. But I'm sure that made it interesting for you.
It was very interesting. And my mom's family was from New York City, so I had a lot of relatives up in that area, and I figured it would be something different. I interviewed with a couple of companies out of the Grand Canyon flying tours, and that seemed like fun, but not terribly challenging, not very interesting.
Right.
So I opted for the New York City job, and it was quite an education. It was experiencing living in an environment that I'd never been in before, with the Northeast winters. Mm-hmm. That's one of the number one reasons I left.
Fair enough.
They said, it only snows a couple of times, and it doesn't ever stick. Well, the first snow I encountered, I had a F-150 truck, and I left it in the driveway and went out to go to work the next morning, and there was a huge pile of snow where my truck had been the night before. And I was an hour and a half late arriving for work that morning because I had to figure out how to shovel myself out.
Yeah.
These are problems a California boy doesn't really consider until after the fact, apparently.
Yeah.
So that was my introduction to New York City winters. And but no, the flying itself was outstanding. Some of the most fun, most challenging flying I've done in a long time.
Right. And so you were with the Army Reserve at this time too. So I mean, that was just sort of limited schedule wise.
Yeah, that was the 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year type flying.
Right.
I commuted every month from New York down to Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd usually stay down in Alabama for 5 or 6 days at a time, do additional drill days, just because it was all coming out of my own pocket. So, the airline, the rental car, the lodging and everything. So I usually had to stay down there about 5 days in order to make the trip pay for itself.
Right.
With my Army pay instead of costing money out of pocket. But that worked out well. It was, I was building flight time in the King Air at the same time. So it was, I wasn't making anything financially from it, but, career wise, I was building some pretty decent experience, and it was an investment. It served me well, and I'd do it all over again if I had to.
Yeah.
Everybody looked at me sideways when I tell them I had to pay to commute back and forth, but it was well worth it.
Right. And during that time period, you got involved with some EMS operations as well, right?
Well, that was the job I took after Heliflight.
Right.
We found out my wife was pregnant, and it quickly became apparent that we weren't going to be able to raise a family on just my salary living in the New York City area. And she had to go back to school anyway. So we decided we were going to move back to Arizona. She was going to go back to ASU while our daughter was young and finish her master's degree.
Wow.
And so I looked for jobs out in Arizona, and there aren't any corporate helicopters. I didn't have quite enough fixed wing time to be competitive for a fixed wing job out there. So I wound up accepting a job flying EMS helicopters. Wound up doing that for just shy of 10 years.
And how did that, I mean, if you did it for 10 years, you must have enjoyed it a bit, but how did it compare to, I guess, the Army and the charter in New York?
Nothing at all like Heliflight in New York City. And actually a lot more similar to Army flying. It was kind of, I don't want to say down and dirty, but it was, you were landing off site. You might land in the middle of a interstate one day and out on the side of a mountain the next day. And it was very unpredictable in that regard. And so from a pilot standpoint, that was great. You were constantly being challenged and thrown scenarios that you'd never thought of before. And how am I going to do this? How am I going to do that? My very first flight, my very first scene call, rather, as an EMS pilot, the sheriff's deputy was trying to get me to land under a set of high tension power lines. And that's where he wanted me, and wasn't going to take no for an answer. And so, there again, frying pan into the fire.
Yep.
Start off getting challenged from day one. But it was EMS flying. It was a great career. I enjoyed the people I worked with. I enjoyed the job. I enjoyed helping people. But there was a lot about it that I don't miss. I worked for one of the largest EMS operators in the country, and the CEO at the time was an accountant and not a pilot, knew nothing about aviation aside from what he learned at this company. And so he was very driven by the bottom line. It was all about making a profit, and it was quite apparent that we as employees were nothing more than tools with which he placated the shareholders. And it was, there was a lot of pressure to do the wrong thing, fly when we shouldn't, fly with broken equipment. So having to constantly stand up to that kind of pressure got old real quick.
Right.
I lost several friends due to perceived pressures. They may or may not have been real, but the perception was definitely there. and that cost several friends during the time I flew EMS.
Wow.
So I did my best to honor their memory by not making the same mistakes, and that didn't win me a whole lot in management. More than once, I got called on the carpet to answer for why I turned a flight down, or why I terminated a flight early, or whatever.
Right.
I was not didn't have many friends in management, and that was okay. My job was to get my crew home in the same or better condition than when they left. That was, if I did that, then it was a good day.
Right.
Yeah.
And we'll circle back to that theme perhaps. But we might as well finish up with sort of the remainder of your career. So, I mean, during that time as well, before we get to what you're doing now, you deployed with the Army Reserve to Iraq, right?
I did. I was originally scheduled to deploy in December 2006, and that got delayed, and they changed the mission, and we wound up going in the end of October 2007. We deployed with 3 airplanes and about 15 pilots. Went over to Balad, which is the largest airbase in Iraq. And again, we were just doing the VIP mission in and around theater. And that was really interesting. That was like flying as close to flying in the Old West as I can imagine. There were some rules, but most of them were kind of guidelines, not really hard rules.
Right.
And you did what you needed to do to get the job done safely. So that was
And you were
interesting.
Piloting there was your main responsibility.
I did. That was my primary job. Yes, I was also the assistant operations officer and safety officer for my unit. But yes, my primary job was pilot command, one of 3 C-12s.
Right.
We got to fly all over the area. Counted them up one time. I think I went to 12 different countries while I was there.
Wow, that's impressive. And you were flying the C-12 as well while you were there?
Right. Yeah,
right.
The VIP mission in the straight C-12, and not the. We had the RC-12s, which are the electronic warfare birds, stationed with us, but that was a separate unit, separate mission. So we were just flying the slick C-12s.
Okay. And you are now department safety manager and a captain at a Part 91 department.
Yes, sir.
How did that transition come about? I guess from EMS would have been just before that.
It was, and it was complete dumb luck. I'm currently flying G4s. We got 3 G4s and 1 AStar helicopter. And how I lucked into this job, I have no idea. I won't claim this to talent or any special skill. But I was sitting at work at my EMS base in Arizona on a Saturday morning, just kind of perusing through the job ads, and I came across a ad for a dual-rated position in Alabama, and one of the specifications they had were that they wanted 500 hours or more in an AStar helicopter. And I had significantly more than that, so I figured, what the heck, send a resume. And, about 3 or 4 weeks later, got a phone call from my current boss and inviting me to come out and chat with them. And I did. And the day after I got home, I received a message offering me the position. They sent me to school for the G4. And 10 months after I started, they promoted me to captain. And just about 8 months ago, they sent me to school at the University of Southern California to become the safety and security manager.
Wow.
It's been a bit of a whirlwind, but it's been a great position, great company. Made some very good friends here, and very grateful for the opportunities they've given me.
Right. And I mean, compared to EMS, it's probably a little bit more predictable. But what what are the things you like most about? I guess this is probably your first Part 91
Yes.
operation. Really, what?
Yeah.
How does it compare to the other stuff you've done, and what are, I guess, the positives and negatives, if there's any?
There are a great number of positives. Flying the G4 is just it's a pilot's dream. It's a beautiful aircraft to fly. It's a big airplane. We fly at 85% of our flights are international, mostly to South America. And it's a very capable airplane, lots of power. There's not much it can't do. We also get to fly the helicopter on rare occasion. It had been used more for executive shuttle work in and around the Birmingham area, but our operations in this area have pretty much shut down in the last couple of years. So that's tapered off, and now we fly the helicopter just for currency. Every now and then an executive will call and ask to use it, but that's maybe 2 or 3 times a year. So more often than not, we go out and fly for an hour here, an hour there, and just do training on our own, which is kind of neat. Not many people go out and hop in a helicopter and go fly it when you want, where you want.
All right.
So that's been a lot of fun. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what does your role as safety manager entail?
What I was tasked with when I went to school was to kind of reinvigorate the safety program. The guy I took over from is one of our maintenance technicians, and he wears about 10 different hats. And he went to the boss and said, as much as I enjoy the safety job, it's not something I have enough time to dedicate right now. So he asked to be relieved, and he's actually still a major influence and a big help for my job.
Mm-hmm.
We work very closely together, so he's still actively involved. It's just he's transferred the hat from himself to me. And what my boss has asked of me is to basically reinvigorate the safety program, seek more participation from everybody in the department, and get people actively involved in being safety minded and just participating. Submitting suggestions, submitting incident reports, just taking a more active role and taking a little bit of ownership in their own safety, if you will.
Right. And I think it becomes a theme when you look back at your whole career, but you mentioned it yourself that you sort of found a passion for aviation safety.
Yes.
But how did that grow through your career? And then you mentioned one instance where you were asked to land near some overhead power lines, but maybe tell a couple stories about where that played a big role in your career.
It started, I'd say, when I was flying in New York City. We were down in Manassas, Virginia at the time, and I was relatively new co-pilot. I hadn't been promoted to captain yet, and the weather was just terrible. There was blizzards and low ceilings and freezing temperatures between us and the airport in Newark. And the boss called and told us that we needed to bring the helicopter back home because we had a flight the next day. Well, I got to looking at the aviation forecasts and the weather, and there was the freezing levels were well below our minimums, and it was just apparent that it wasn't going to be possible to do the flight safely. I mean, we'd be scud running, and the last thing you want to do in a helicopter is get it iced up.
Right.
And that was a very real possibility. So I talked to the captain about it, and he was a little more experienced than I was, but also a little more willing to kind of go take a look, so to speak. And I finally had to put my foot down and say, I'm not getting in the helicopter. I'm not flying today. It's not safe. It's not going to happen. And I got called on the carpet for that when we did get back, which was 2 days later.
Mm-hmm.
And I offered my resignation right there on the spot. I said, if this is how you want me to operate, then maybe I'm not the right fit for this company, and maybe need to find somebody else who's more willing to bend the rules and push the limits. And that kind of got my boss's attention, and he said, well, no, let's stop and think about this. I don't think we need to get that drastic. And I think it set the tone, though. It got his attention, and from that point forward, we had a great relationship.
Right.
As there was an understanding.
Right.
I'm not going to be the one out there pushing a bad weather situation, for the sake of chasing a dollar.
Right.
And never had an issue with that company again. But when I got to EMS, I saw more of the same. I saw pilots, and EMS was kind of unique in that there were a lot of older pilots, a lot of retired military guys, and a lot of younger pilots, not many in between. The younger pilots were still relatively new in their careers, hired with the minimum flight times, and probably in their mid to late 20s, and still very susceptible to pressures from management. Think you will do this, you will do that, and the first two friends I lost were in that category. They were younger guys, lower flight times, less experience, and eager to please. They were going to go out and they were going to save the day, and they had this Superman complex, as a lot of EMS pilots do. And they had it in their heads that they were going to go out and save lives. Well, that wasn't our job description. Our job description was to save lives by knowing when to say no. And these guys, I don't judge them. I don't judge the decisions they made, but there are lessons to be learned there, and it's taken a lot of flight crew memorials to get that message through, I think. And the companies have gotten better about the pressures. When I first started flying, there was no restriction. The dispatcher could call and tell you that there's a 2-year-old laying on the side of a road out, in the middle of nowhere, and they're going to die unless you take them to the hospital. Well, obviously, that's placing a great deal of psychological pressure on the pilot to go out and fly.
Right.
One of the hardest flights I've ever turned down was right after they stopped or they mandated that the dispatchers not tell you anything about who the patient was. But there are still ways to figure that out. And that's what happened on this night. I was flying down in the Tucson area, and I got a call about 11:30 at night that there had been a car wreck on Interstate 10, and the special request was whether or not I'd have enough fuel to make it to Phoenix Children's Hospital.
Right.
Well, okay. He didn't technically tell me anything about the patient, but going to Phoenix Children's Hospital with a car wreck, I knew it was a pediatric trauma. And I looked at the weather, and there were thunderstorms all over the place. And of course, the Tucson area has mountains upwards of 11,000 feet. And at the time, we weren't using night vision goggles, so it was all unaided flying out across open desert, which is fairly demanding. And there's not a whole lot of lights out there, not a whole lot of ground reference. So I figured that the path I would have to take to get to the accident and then get to Phoenix Children's Hospital, I wouldn't have enough fuel. I'd have to land and get fuel en route. And that was if I could get through it all. The weather was relatively ugly that night. I would have been dodging thunderstorms left and right. And I determined that the safest option for everybody was just to take the patient by ground to Tucson and not risk my crew, my aircraft, trying to get out there to get to the patient. I wasn't going to help anybody by flying into the side of a mountain. And I laid awake the rest of the night looking at weather and trying to see if I could have done anything differently, knowing logically that I made the right call, but still knowing in the back of my head that there's an injured child out there and that I may or may not have been the difference between life and death. It was a kind of an eye-opening experience. It was the first time I ever said no to a flight where I knew it was a critical child. And, I've got a soft spot for children. So the desire to get out there and help was that much stronger that night. And turning that flight down was the hardest thing I'd done in my professional career at that point.
Yeah. I can certainly understand why they implemented rules not telling you who's there, because that's, as you said, that's a huge pressure, knowing that.
It is. And of course, the first thing I saw the next morning in the newspaper was that there had been a car accident and a family of 4 had been killed or died from their injuries, not been killed in the accident. So that was the call I had been called for, and neither one of the children made it. Of course, there's no way to know if they would have made it if I had flown, but it didn't make it any easier to read about it.
As you say, though, I mean, certainly doesn't help the situation if you wreck the helicopter on the way.
No, absolutely not. And that's, that was the only comfort in any of it was, the weather was terrible. It was unsafe to fly. And I wouldn't have been helping anybody. Worst case scenario, we got to the patient and had to land in the middle of nowhere to avoid flying into a thunderstorm or a mountain and have the patient stuck in the helicopter when they could have been at least at a hospital via ground ambulance. And that's just one example of many that happened thereafter. But learning when and how to say no was the hardest part of that job.
Sure.
Like I said,
yeah. Go ahead. You now maintain a few Facebook groups related to the topics of aviation safety, right?
Yeah. We have, goodness, I've lost track of how many there are exactly. The active ones, there's about 8 of
Okay.
them, and they vary from career mentorship, just general career mentorship for up and coming pilots, place for more experienced pilots to kind of guide and help the next generation. And there's, we get a variety of questions and answers in there, but it's a great resource. I wish I had when I was coming up.
Mm-hmm.
Then we've got a job listings group that's specifically for aviation jobs and the people looking for them. That's our largest group. We've got just under 21,000 members in that group right now, and adding about 800 and 900 every month.
Wow.
And then I do have a couple of aviation safety groups, one specific to EMS flying, another one just a generic aviation safety group that's actually not nearly as active as I'd like it to be. It's come to my attention that safety is kind of a 4-letter word to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants it, but nobody wants to work for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's something they want to be there. So trying to figure out how to change that mindset has been a challenge.
Yeah, well, I'll get you to send me a list of those, and we'll put them in
absolutely.
the show notes. So you also just mentioned it, but helping people find their career path or navigate their career path is also a passion you mentioned.
Definitely.
How do you try and help people, or what advice do you offer, and what advice should they ignore?
Best advice I can offer to anybody is to be true to yourself and to be integral with your word. Those two things have served me very well in my career. I see a lot of deception, a lot of people trying to be something they're not to please somebody else. And that comes in various different forms and iterations, but basically there isn't any one golden ticket. There's not any one magic formula that's going to get you the career of your dreams. If I'd had to map out my career, it wouldn't look anything like what it actually played out as. But I'm extremely grateful and fortunate for what I have experienced. I've done a lot of things that most people can only dream about, and they're all things that I never thought I'd ever do. But it all boiled down to knowing what was right for me and not being afraid to take the path less taken or less traveled by, I guess is the official quote.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, in these groups I run, I see people constantly trying to tell other people what they need to do or what they have to do. And while the intent behind those suggestions is noble and it's well intentioned, people don't realize that what's right for me might not be right for somebody else, and it's not up to me to decide how you need to go about your career. I'll offer suggestions and I'll tell you about the way I did it all day long, and I'll do whatever I can to help you, but I'm not going to tell you you need to do this and you need to do that. And I think that's what's missing for a lot of people. A lot of people seem to think that the way they did it is the only way to do it, and it's the only right way, and it's not. The big ongoing debate has to do with being a flight instructor. When I was learning to fly, becoming a flight instructor was the way to build hours and build experience, and get to the point where you were competitive for an airline job or a corporate job or whatever. But in today's market, there are pilots with 400 or 500, 600 hours being hired into the right seat of Gulfstreams and other jets that you used to have thousands of hours to even be considered for. So the market has changed significantly, and the mindset of the older pilots seems to be that if you want to succeed, you have to do it the same way I did it. And that's just not the case anymore. Like I said, the intentions are all good, but it's for me, it's about following your goals and knowing yourself well enough to know what's right for you. And a lot of people can't seem to figure that out. So,
yeah, no, I think that's the principles behind building a good career are more important than the specific planning
right.
itself, which, when we talk about your career, it seems like, well, you said it yourself that, the last job you got was kind of the dumb luck, but
yeah, I didn't know.
Behind that dumb luck was, a little bit of planning to know that, you'd like to get your fixed wing certification before you got out of the Army, as that was also, something you'd wanted to do for a long time. And you felt it was a valuable asset as well. And you took that extra time to build those hours and so on. So,
Right.
as much as it seemed like dumb luck at the time, that was the result of, partially at least, some the principles that you applied to planning.
There was some foundation laid there.
Yeah.
And what I didn't mention is while I was flying EMS, I had actually been offered several jobs flying jets and doing various and assorted other things. But that would have taken me away from my family. And at the time, my priorities were to spend time at home as much as possible. I had a young daughter, and the EMS schedule allowed me to do that. So while I wanted to go fly jets, the opportunities I was presented just weren't right for my situation. And again, a lot of other people questioned me for turning those jobs down. And from a traditional pilot logic standpoint, turning them down made no sense. There were a couple of excellent opportunities, or what would have been excellent opportunities had I been, a younger single guy or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it didn't fit my needs. So there again, knowing what I wanted and what I needed for my family and I, and what was best for us, didn't fit the traditional mold, and got me a lot of strange looks.
Right.
But there again, I wouldn't change anything about it.
No, and I mean, again, like you built a solid enough foundation that, it's not guaranteed, but there's probably going to be other opportunities that came along, which, as it turns out, they did. Yeah,
they did, and this job came along, and it was clear that what it offered aligned almost perfectly with what I was looking for, and everything fell into place, and here we are. And again, very grateful, very thankful for the way things have played out.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, so we'll do one more question here and then a few quicker ones, and we'll wrap up. I want to make sure I'm respectful of your time. So, getting away from aviation a little bit here, you mentioned some of your hobbies outside aviation include drumming, cooking, and photography. So tell me about how you got into one of those or all of them, and what role they play in your life.
Well, the cooking is easy. I like to eat.
That is a good reason to cook. Yeah.
And come to find out, I'm rather picky about what I eat. So therefore, it was in my best interest to learn how to at least be a halfway decent chef. I won't claim any great skill or anything, and I'm sure Gordon Ramsay would tear me apart. But it's just something I enjoy. It's relaxing, and my family seems to enjoy it when I cook for it.
What's your favorite thing to cook?
Oh, I love broiling a good steak, some asparagus. I've recently started to make swordfish for my wife and daughter. I don't
Oh, wow.
don't eat seafood, but I started making it for them, and apparently I'm doing a good job as they keep asking for it.
Wow. Okay.
Love to make homemade Alfredo sauce and various pastas. My mom is a amazing cook, and growing up, our Sunday pasta dinners were always something to look forward to. So I'm trying to live up to her standards. I'll try new things all the time. My daughter's on Pinterest, and she's coming to me every so often with new recipes and ideas, and so we'll try those together. And she's actually a much better cook than I am, so
Nice.
it kind of kind of fun watching her grow and figure things out and teach me. And then what else? Drums. I've been playing drums since I was about 11 years old, on and off. There again, nothing professional grade, just kind of a hack. But in the last about the last 9 months, I've taken it up a little more seriously. My daughter got involved in an organization called Rock Band League, which is for kids, I think, 10 to 18 years old. And they break the kids up into different bands, and they have a couple of performances throughout the season. This spring season, they've got an adult version of the same, and so I signed up for that. And I'm in a small band, and we're working on about 15 different songs. And eventually, one of these days, we're going to have a performance, but not sure when or where.
Nice.
But it's fun just to get together with folks and kind of bang around a little bit, and it's been a lot of fun. Good to get back into it. It's a great stress reliever and way to relax.
Sure.
And then what was the other? Oh, photography. That's just I've always had a camera in my hand, and just kind of like documenting places I go and things I see, and
Sure.
putting them all together in a collage, or whatever, on share them on Facebook.
Yeah.
Just creates timeline.
Yeah. It's a good way to remember things.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll wrap up with some quicker ones. What is one of your favorite flights that you've ever flown? And or your favorite place to fly?
One of the most memorable flights, would have to say, would be Christmas morning in Iraq. I normally flew the night flights, so I'd go into work around 6 p.m. and fly till 6 or 7 o'clock the next morning. And I'd fly with my little iPod in one ear. And we were coming back from Kuwait City to Baghdad one night, or this particular night. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day. And the radio was unusually quiet, nobody yapping. Controllers were all pretty mellow, and the visibility was unusually clear. I could see, we were probably 300 miles south of Baghdad, and I could already see the lights of the city. All of a sudden, Silent Night came on my iPod, and it was just kind of a surreal experience, just sitting there droning along 28,000 feet, and I don't mean to get religious on you or anything. I'm not. But it was just kind of interesting to think that this is where all that story happened, and things hadn't changed a whole lot in the 2,000 years since, and I wasn't too far away from all of it, and it was. Not sure how to describe it. I kept a blog while I was over there, and that was one of my favorite blog entries. Described it a whole lot better than I just did, but
no, I could definitely see that. That's
it was a really unique and kind of special experience.
Yeah, a very unique combination of a bunch of things.
Yeah, it's kind of a juxtaposition of being in a war zone on Christmas, and it was something I won't forget.
Yeah, wow.
And that was definitely one of them. My favorite places to fly would have to be Catalina Island and Santa Barbara back in LA. And my most memorable flight was taking my mom and dad and my sister, Cessna 172. We went from Burbank Airport to Santa Barbara, and I took them out to dinner at the Elephant Bar, which was an airport restaurant right there as you could taxi up to. I did that 3 days after I got my private pilot's license.
Oh, wow.
And that was the only time my dad ever flew with me. And it was a big deal for him to get in a little airplane. He was terrified of them. So
that's a great way to celebrate.
Yeah, it was. I was really proud of that, and like I said, it was the only time he ever flew with me. So that was probably my favorite flight of all time.
Wow. Cool. Well, I think that's a great way to end.
Outstanding.
Thanks so much, Gene. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
What's the best way for people to reach out to you, either online or otherwise?
My email address is all lowercase. It's Gene_Bishop, GENE_BISHOP at Yahoo. Or I'm on LinkedIn, also under Gene Bishop. And I'd be happy to hear from anybody and everybody.
Perfect. We'll link those as well as the Facebook groups in the show notes.
Excellent. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Gene, for taking the time.
Thank you, Graham. I appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Just a reminder, you can find show notes, links to everything we talked about, and more at leansystems.co/podcast. And I would encourage you to sign up for our email list to make sure you get notified about new blog posts and podcasts. See you next time.